Beneath the foam suits, behind the creature masks, and just outside the spotlight, a hidden cast carried the weight of British cinema's strangest dreams. They were knights, aliens, goblins, and cats. Rarely credited, often forgotten, always smaller than the roles demanded. This isn't a tribute. It's a reckoning. Because the story of 17 little-known British stars isn't about fantasy. It's about visibility. And what happens when an entire industry builds magic on the backs of people it refuses to name. Welcome to the forgotten faces behind the myth. You've seen their work. You just never saw them. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed for more strange cinematic deep dives just like this one. It helps the channel survive, and helps these hidden stories keep rising to the surface. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight? Lunch break? 3 a.m. with the curtains drawn? We want to know who's out there in the dark with us. 1. Kenny Baker. By the time Kenny Baker became the most famous man you'd never recognize, he'd already spent years learning how to disappear in plain sight. British entertainment, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, had a specific use for people like him. It needed small bodies, not names. He was perfect for it. Small in stature, just 3 feet 8 inches, but extremely mobile, cheerful on set, and crucially, willing to spend hours inside costumes no one else wanted to touch. Before Star Wars immortalized him in metal, Baker was already a staple of traveling performance groups and television oddities. His early career was mostly panto and variety shows, the kind where the plot didn't matter, only the visual punchline did. A little person in a giant chair, a talking puppet who turned out to be real. These were the kinds of jokes Britain found endlessly recyclable. And in this ecosystem, Kenny learned something quietly tragic. Visibility often came at the cost of visibility. When George Lucas cast him as R2-D2, it wasn't for his face, or his voice, or his ideas. It was for his ability to hunch into a can-shaped droid casing and roll across sand dunes without complaining. It made him internationally famous, and completely faceless. He was mobbed at conventions, had his name printed on lunchboxes, and became one of the most identifiable unknowns in cinema history. Yet behind the panels and circuitry was a man who spent much of his working life sitting in silence while others spoke through him. Baker's fame proved that even a global franchise could rely on someone and still keep them hidden. Because being necessary is not the same as being seen. And that was a lesson Jack Purvis would learn too. Except his face did get shown, over and over, sometimes by accident, sometimes as a punchline. 2. Jack Purvis. If Kenny Baker was the silent core of the machine, Jack Purvis was the loud little glitch in the system. Slightly taller, endlessly louder, and unreasonably versatile, Purvis was the kind of actor who could steal a scene even when the scene didn't want to be stolen. Which was a problem, because most scenes he got were supposed to be silent, anonymous, or preferably, buried under a latex goblin face. Purvis had that rarest of things among little people in mid-century British film, a speaking role. Actually several. Not leads, of course, let's not get ahead of ourselves. But his voice, raspy, fast, cocky, poked through the background noise of films like Time Bandits, Willow, and The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Terry Gilliam loved casting him. Maybe because Purvis could sell a single line with so much heat, it felt like he'd been there the whole film. Still, every role had an asterisk. Even his most recognizable parts, the bandit gang leader, the loud-mouthed creature, the snarling sidekick, were little man parts. If a script had the word dwarf in it, his phone rang. If it didn't, it didn't. Typecasting doesn't just mean playing the same role. It means never getting to try another one. Purvis was boxed in by roles that wanted his stature, but not his story. His characters had wild arcs, but Jack never got one of his own. Even in Star Wars, where he appeared multiple times, he played different small alien types, each time silent, suited, and unnamed. The franchise kept calling him back, but never by name, just as a shape, a presence, a height. Eventually, a spinal injury ended his career. Not dramatically, not symbolically, just a quiet exit from a life of loud entries. And yet, for all his gruff charisma, Purvis never crossed the final threshold: respect. Which makes what David Rappaport did next all the more strange. Because Rappaport didn't just ask for respect. He demanded the mic, and for a while, he got it. If you've made it this far, you're clearly one of us. Drawn to the overlooked, the offbeat, and the almost forgotten. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. These stories don't tell themselves, and this channel survives because of people like you. While you're at it, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it? Are you up late with headphones on? Or sneaking this in during daylight hours? We're building a strange little archive here. And you're part of it now. 3. David Rappaport. David Rappaport didn't walk onto sets. He arrived like a question no one wanted to answer. Standing just over 3 feet tall, he looked like the kind of actor casting directors thought they understood. Fantasy, comedy, a novelty in a trench coat. But Rappaport had no interest in being ornamental. He wanted the role, the frame, the close-up. And for a brief moment in the 1980s, the industry let him have it. You could see it in Time Bandits, where he played Randall, the fast-talking leader of the film's dimension-hopping band of thieves. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Rappaport got lines. He got presence. And crucially, he got a character arc. He wasn't a silent suit in the background. He was the plot engine, commanding the frame with a wild charisma that didn't apologize for his stature. And audiences noticed. Especially in America, where he soon found a new kind of spotlight in television roles that, shockingly, weren't all mythical creatures or circus tropes. But that kind of visibility came at a cost. For actors of short stature, especially in the 1980s, being seen outside of a goblin costume wasn't just rare, it was structurally unsustainable. The industry didn't know what to do with a little person who demanded to be treated as a full-size character. Rappaport was brilliant, biting, and absolutely unwilling to be framed as an exception to a rule he didn't accept. And then, he vanished. The industry's enthusiasm for him burned bright, but not long. His most ambitious projects remained unfinished. His legacy now floats in limbo, neither mythologized nor erased, just incomplete. And while Rappaport tried to kick the door open, the next name on the list walked right through it, in full fantasy regalia, with the audience cheering. Because unlike most little actors of the era, Warwick Davis didn't have to steal the spotlight. It was handed to him, sort of. 4. Warwick Davis. Warwick Davis was 12 years old when he became an Ewok. He didn't audition. He wasn't even supposed to be in the film. He was just on set, standing in for someone taller who couldn't make it. Then Lucas noticed him. And in one of those strange industry turns where a child's height became destiny, Davis became Wicket. He also became something much rarer, a household name. But let's be clear. Davis didn't get there because the system evolved. He got there because he learned how to navigate the system better than most. At 3 feet 6 inches, with a form of spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia congenita, Davis entered a profession where height-based casting was still the norm. But he did what almost no one else in his category had managed to do. Build a career that extended beyond anonymity, beyond creature suits, and eventually beyond typecasting itself. Willow was the turning point, a fantasy epic where he wasn't just the sidekick or the mascot, but the hero, the title character. A leading man in a world where his size wasn't a joke or a twist, but a fact. Still limiting, still specific, but no longer invisible. Audiences didn't have to guess what he looked like. He wasn't hidden behind prosthetics. For once, a little person got to be the protagonist in his own story. Davis didn't stop there. He carved out a unique industry space, repeating roles in major franchises, producing content, even co-founding Little People UK to support other performers like him. It's easy to frame him as a success story, but that flattens the truth. Davis didn't overcome the system. He maneuvered within it, dodging typecasting landmines and eventually using his visibility as a shield for others. He became the rare exception, and every exception needs context, which is where Samantha Davis comes in. Because her story isn't about the spotlight, it's about the work that happened when the spotlight looked away. 5. Samantha Davis. Samantha Davis lived in the wings of the fantasy world that made her husband famous. But her presence, on set and far beyond it, was anything but background. Before she became a quiet cornerstone of advocacy for people with dwarfism, she was part of the same behind-the-mask casting system that defined an era. You likely didn't see her name in the credits, and you almost certainly didn't see her face. But she was there, in the crowd scenes of Labyrinth, in the creature villages of Willow, and in the same unspoken category that shaped the careers of so many of her peers. Small body, magical setting, no lines. Born with achondroplasia, Samantha grew up with the same physical reality that shaped casting decisions across British film in the 1970s and 80s. Her work was largely uncredited, but constant. Costume-heavy productions needed performers who could move nimbly in puppeted environments, who could endure long hours in uncomfortable suits and who wouldn't, challenge the script's visual shorthand for fantastical. She fit the industry's need, and that was both the opportunity and the trap. But unlike many who quietly exited the business when CGI began replacing suit actors, Samantha kept going, just in a different lane. With Warwick, she co-founded Little People UK, one of the most visible support networks for people with dwarfism in Britain. It wasn't a glamorous move. It was structural. She understood that careers were only possible when the industry had frameworks, legal, medical, communal, to keep performers safe, visible, and respected. Samantha's story isn't about stardom. It's about what happens after the credits roll. She built a scaffolding beneath a collapsing genre and gave newer performers a platform she never had. And that idea, quiet influence, invisible work, leads us straight into the career of Peter Burroughs, the man who proved that behind every fantasy ensemble was someone organizing the chaos, even if they never got a line. 6. Peter Burroughs. Peter Burroughs might be the most industrious man you've never heard of, unless you've read a casting call for goblins, Ewoks, or enchanted background villagers in a 1980s British fantasy film. He was everywhere and nowhere, usually in costume, frequently uncredited, and almost always working. At just over 4 feet tall, Burroughs was a quintessential industry figure in an era when little people were more likely to be hired for their silhouettes than their scripts. But he wasn't just an actor. He was a builder, a connector, someone who understood the ephemeral economy of short-stature casting and figured out how to make it sustainable. His screen roles tell only half the story. Flash Gordon, Labyrinth, The Dark Crystal, Doctor Who, Return of the Jedi, each one adding a quiet notch to an expansive, largely anonymous resume. What mattered more was what he did off camera. Peter didn't just accept the system, he reverse-engineered it. In later years, he founded Willow Management, a talent agency specializing in short-stature performers. The name wasn't subtle. It was a clear nod to the film that had featured him, his son-in-law Warwick Davis, and a small army of little actors hidden behind prosthetics. The agency became one of the few organized structures giving short-stature performers real access to screen work, on their terms. He turned marginalization into infrastructure. In a business that thrived on typecasting, Peter offered guidance, placement, protection, a future. He never had a lead role. Most people wouldn't recognize him without a still frame and a red circle around his face. But without him, half the fantasy productions in Britain would have fallen apart before lunch. And yet, even among the familiar faces in this system, there were rare breakthroughs, like Mike Edmonds, who somehow ended up on British kids' TV yelling punchlines instead of growling from inside a mask. 7. Mike Edmonds. Mike Edmonds was one of those rare figures who made it out of the costume department and into the living room. Still in character, but finally as a character. You probably didn't know his name, but if you grew up on British children's TV in the late 80s or early 90s, you definitely knew Little Ron from Maid Marian and Her Merry Men. A full-on comedic role, with jokes, and a personality, and, most shocking of all for a performer with achondroplasia during that era, a name in the credits. Born in 1944, Edmonds spent much of his early career exactly where the industry expected him to be: inside suits, helmets, and masks. Time Bandits, Return of the Jedi, The Dark Crystal, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He was there, always essential, rarely visible. He made a living playing everything from goblins to aliens to dungeon creatures, and did so with a kind of physical dynamism that producers loved, as long as no one could see his face. But Little Ron changed that. Suddenly, Edmonds wasn't a prop. He was a comic force, bouncing off Tony Robinson and stealing scenes with absurd confidence. It was still comedy rooted in size. This was British TV, after all. But Edmonds played it with a self-awareness that made the whole setup feel like a cheerful subversion of the usual tropes. He didn't become a mainstream star, but he cracked the formula. He proved that a little person on British television didn't have to be mystical, mute, or inhuman to get a laugh. Just clever, present, and loud. But for every Mike Edmonds carving a space on screen, there were others dealing with much messier intersections of public image, disability, and expectation. Few were as publicly beloved or as cruelly misframed as Eric Cullen. 8. Eric Cullen. Eric Cullen was funny. That's what made things complicated. As a short-stature actor with achondroplasia in 1980s and 90s Scotland, he found work where you'd expect comedy. He became a fixture on Rab C. Nesbitt, one of the most culturally embedded sitcoms of the era, playing Wee Bernie, a role that used his height as both a visual punchline and an emotional undercurrent. But Cullen wasn't a background gag. He was a character with presence, agency, and, most subversively, pathos. His performance gave Wee Bernie layers. The laughs didn't always come from size. Sometimes they came from timing, from delivery, from sheer comic instinct. And audiences loved him for it. For a while he became one of the few little people on UK television with a recurring named role in a mainstream series. Not a creature, not a panto role, not a costumed background blur. A person. Still, the visibility came with its costs. Cullen's public persona was relentlessly shaped by his appearance, no matter how complex his performance was. Interviews often veered into novelty territory. Headlines leaned into spectacle. And while Cullen tried to use his platform to speak more broadly about representation and disability, the media had other ideas. They wanted a hook, not a thesis. His later life was turbulent, marked by tabloid distortion and personal turmoil. But the version of him that remains in the public memory is inseparable from that singular performance. A funny, furious, sharply expressive presence in a sitcom that gave him just enough space to complicate the joke. Eric Cullen was proof that the right actor could turn a limiting premise into something enduring. But the industry still wasn't ready to make space for more. And so, once again, the narrative shifted back into the shadows, with George Clayton, who helped define an era of visible invisibility in fantasy and pop culture. 9. George Clayton. George Clayton lived in the space between prestige and punchline. You could find him in everything from cult cinema to biblical epics, often buried under wigs or fur or some elaborate makeup design intended to make him unrecognizable. A visual irony, given how often audiences still manage to recognize him. Not by name, of course. That wasn't the industry's style, but by presence. A familiar short figure in yet another mythical background. Born in 1933, Clayton worked through decades of shifting taste, from 1960s psychedelia to 1980s fantasy horror. His credits included Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where he played one of the original Oompa Loompas, before they were digital clones, and Magical Mystery Tour, where he appeared alongside the Beatles in what was either avant-garde brilliance or complete nonsense, depending on who you asked. Clayton was, for a time, the go-to man when producers needed a little person who could blend absurdity with theatrical presence. But his career also highlights a contradiction. He was both highly visible and functionally invisible. In roles like Ginarbrick in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, 1967, or as a spectacle addition in variety specials, he was clearly acting but rarely acknowledged. Often credited generically as dwarf, midget, or creature, Clayton's actual performances were subsumed by the role of being a body that fit the aesthetic. And yet, through repetition, he became a known unknown, an actor with no close-up who still managed to leave a mark. Clayton's filmography is a case study in how 20th century media could rely heavily on little performers without ever quite letting them in. And if Clayton was the stoic veteran of this system, then Malcolm Dixon was the loyal soldier, consistently present, perpetually masked, and occasionally, unmistakably, himself. 10. Malcolm Dixon. Malcolm Dixon had one of those faces that directors love to hide, not because it was forgettable, but because it was too expressive, too human, too much of a reminder that the goblin, elf, or Ewok you were watching wasn't just a special effect, it was a person. That was a problem in a system that wanted magic without reality. Standing just over 4 feet tall, Dixon became a fantasy regular in the late 1970s and 80s. He played Strutter in Time Bandits, one of the film's most recognizable supporting roles, and appeared in Flash Gordon, Labyrinth, and Return of the Jedi, a hat trick of cult franchises that used little people liberally, though rarely equitably. If there was a role that required a short, agile actor to wear 30 pounds of latex and not blink for 4 hours, Dixon was near the top of the list. What sets Dixon apart is not the volume of his work, it's the pattern. He was part of a generation who found steady employment through fantasy, cinema's obsession with scale. In these roles, size wasn't incidental, it was essential. Whole sets were designed around exaggerated perspective. Whole scenes existed purely to juxtapose the tall and the small. And within that aesthetic, Dixon worked. A lot. But never outside of it. He was, by all accounts, a reliable presence on set, a skilled physical performer. But his name rarely crossed into public consciousness. Like so many of his peers, he existed in the cultural periphery, central to the scene, but not to the story. Still, every once in a while, a short-stature actor broke through the foam latex ceiling and made it into pop iconography. Rusty Goffe did that, mostly by accident, mostly by showing up, and somehow always by being the smallest one in the room. 11. Rusty Goffe. Rusty Goffe is the kind of actor whose career reads like a scavenger hunt through British pop culture. Born in 1948 and standing just over 4 feet tall, he appeared in so many iconic productions that audiences began to spot him like an Easter egg. Wait, isn't that the Oompa Loompa guy? And yes, he was. One of them anyway. In the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, 1971, Goffe became part of an ensemble that was both instantly memorable and, paradoxically, stripped of individuality. His role as an Oompa Loompa became his most recognized performance, though it involved no lines, no character backstory, and certainly no named credit in the original marketing. But for many viewers, it was enough. Goffe's image, orange skin, green hair, bouncing through choreographed moral lessons, was seared into childhood memories across generations. Yet that role was just the beginning. Goffe went on to perform in Star Wars, 1977, Flash Gordon, and decades later in the Harry Potter films, still playing small, often costumed roles. The continuity is eerie. The genre evolves. The budgets explode. The costumes get fancier. And there's Goffe, still playing creatures, still being hired because of his height. The press liked to call him versatile, and in a way, he was. But it's hard to ignore how that versatility kept him in a tight visual loop. Different franchises, same role, unnamed, costumed, peripheral. There's a kind of endurance in that. But there's also a ceiling, one made of fiberglass, latex, and an endless supply of prosthetic noses. And just when you think you've seen the limits of this casting pattern, along comes Sadie Corré, a woman whose whole career was built on a duality: the mask she wore and the cat she played. 12. Sadie Corré. Sadie Corré was 4 feet 2 inches of pure theatrical chaos. Born in 1918, she spent most of her life bouncing between 2 very different stages: the glitter-strewn world of British pantomime and the foggy, budget-stretched sets of film and television. For nearly 5 decades, she played cats, goblins, grannies, and anything else the script needed her to become, as long as it was small, funny, or strange. Corré's signature role was not from cinema but the stage. She was known as the world's smallest cat in pantomime. Year after year, in glittering, whiskered costume, she crawled across stages, meowing to delighted audiences. It was work that blurred the line between performer and novelty. She embraced it, or at least, she endured it. In film, her face was rarely the main event, but she made enough appearances to become a recognizable figure in cult cinema. She showed up in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Wombling Free, and was reportedly among the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi. If a production needed a short-stature woman who could move like a puppet and keep a straight face while doing it, Sadie got the call. Her filmography is sparse, but not forgettable. Because Corré wasn't just part of an ensemble. She was a symbol of how the industry handled women of short stature, cast them when needed, hide them in plain sight, then send them back into the wings. And yet, she lasted, not by fighting the system, but by staying useful to it. Like many of her peers, she learned how to keep working without ever being truly seen. Which brings us to Marcus Powell, a performer about whom we know just enough to realize how little the archives remember. 13. Marcus Powell. Marcus Powell was one of the many performers whose names floated through the margins of mid-century British cinema, sometimes credited, sometimes mislabeled, sometimes just there. He's widely associated with Wombling Free, 1977, credited as playing Orinoco, one of the fuzzy, morally earnest creatures adapted from the beloved children's TV series. He's also frequently linked to the Oompa Loompa ensemble in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, 1971. Although, like many of the actors involved in that production, documentation is inconsistent. What we're left with is a career made up of half-visible roles, questionable credits, and the persistent sense that he was always somewhere on set, just rarely in focus. Powell's story isn't singular because of a starring role or a career-defining performance. It's singular because it captures a type, the working little person actor of the post-war era who showed up, did the job, and then vanished back into obscurity, with only a handful of IMDb entries to prove they were ever there. These were not men chasing fame. They were workers in a niche market where the work was physically demanding, the recognition minimal, and the roles frequently reduced to caricature. What Powell's limited public record tells us is more about the industry than about him. That someone could perform in 2 of the most iconic children's films of the 1970s and still have so little biographical information recorded speaks volumes. It reveals an era in which certain performers were functionally invisible, even as they helped define the visual DNA of the films themselves. And if Powell represents that broader invisibility, Albert Wilkinson shows us another version of the same vanishing act. A performer with repeat appearances in cult classics, and yet a presence that history seemed to forget on purpose. 14. Albert Wilkinson. Albert Wilkinson's career is the kind that lives in trivia sections. He was there, in Labyrinth, in Countess Dracula, in Wombling Free. But you'd be forgiven for not knowing that, because even when he was on screen, he was rarely seen. His face was hidden, his voice dubbed, his name buried somewhere near the bottom of the credits, if it showed up at all. But make no mistake, he was part of the engine room of British fantasy cinema in the 1970s and 80s. That rotating cast of short-stature performers whose job was to bring scale, whimsy, or weirdness to an otherwise average production. Wilkinson, like many of his contemporaries, was cast not because of who he was, but what he represented. A particular size, a silhouette that could be tucked into a puppet, a fantasy creature, a magical assistant. His role as Tomsk in Wambling Free places him among that ensemble of little people performers who populated the film's practical costume Womble cast. They danced, stumbled, moralized, and carried lunchboxes, but the actors inside them were, for the most part, anonymized. There's very little public record of Wilkinson beyond those recurring genre credits. No interviews, no retrospectives, no archived memoirs about what it was like inside a heavy foam suit on a hot studio set. And that silence isn't just about personal privacy. It's about an entire industry that didn't think the experience of its smallest performers was worth documenting. Wilkinson's presence is proof that being on camera isn't the same as being remembered. He was part of an era, a system, a formula that used performers like ingredients. Important for the final dish, but forgotten once the plate was cleared. Skip Martin, though, he was harder to forget. Not because the system treated him better, but because he carried a kind of eerie charisma that turned even the smallest roles into something you couldn't quite look away from. 15. Skip Martin. Skip Martin didn't need a spotlight. He glowed on his own, in that strange off-kilter way that certain character actors do. Born in 1928 and standing just over 4 feet tall, he slipped through the cracks of British genre cinema with a presence that felt larger than life, despite the industry's determined efforts to keep him small. Not just physically small, but narratively, reputationally, boxed into roles that often leaned more toward visual oddity than character work. Martin appeared in horror films, fantasy flicks, and anything that needed a touch of the uncanny. He had that face, sharp, expressive, almost impish, and he used it. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he didn't always vanish under a mask or prosthetic. He was often right there, in frame, doing what few little actors were permitted to do at the time. Act with his face. And yet, even with that on-screen visibility, Martin was stuck in a recurring loop of genre casting. He played jesters, imps, unnamed goblins, figures meant to unsettle or amuse, but never humanize. His filmography often reads like a gothic funhouse. Haunted manors, mad scientists, cursed carnivals. These were stories where his size was used not as narrative background, but as thematic punctuation. He wasn't offered much, but he did a lot with it. There's something eerie about how he lingers in old films, not quite central, never forgettable. He's the man in the background who somehow becomes the thing you remember. Skip Martin was proof that even the most restrictive casting could accidentally generate iconography, not by design, by resistance, by talent seeping through the cracks of the script. And that quiet resistance didn't end with him. Eileen Baker, another Womble-suited regular, lived in the very same system, but navigated it with a different kind of invisibility. Familial, collective, and almost entirely undocumented. 16. Eileen Baker. Eileen Baker may not have been a household name, but she was a household presence, the kind you'd find quietly embedded in some of the most iconic scenes in British fantasy, never demanding your attention but always earning it. Like many of her peers, Baker spent much of her career inside costumes, beneath layers of foam and felt, animating characters whose fame far outpaced the recognition of those who brought them to life. She was one of the core performers in Wambling Free, playing Tobermory, yet another example of a little-person performer whose labor was central, but whose identity was secondary. The voices were dubbed, the faces were concealed, the credits were minimal. And still, she showed up. Again and again. Later, she joined the vast ensemble of Ewok performers in Return of the Jedi, becoming part of that now legendary cluster of British talent who made outer space feel oddly familiar. But Baker's story was more than just professional. She was also married to Kenny Baker, yes, R2-D2 himself. And together they formed a kind of quiet dynasty within this niche, high-demand corner of the industry. And yet, even in that partnership, her contributions were rarely spotlighted. Where Kenny was celebrated, even if reductively, Eileen was often just listed, or omitted entirely. Her public biographical footprint is minimal, like many women in the same line of work. We know she had dwarfism. We know her children did not inherit it. We know she worked, steadily, invisibly, physically, in roles that asked for everything but rarely gave much in return. Eileen Baker's career reads like a footnote. But without her, entire films would have one less heartbeat beneath the fabric. And speaking of performers mistaken for footnotes, the next and final figure on our list was once believed to be a child. Until people realized he never grew up because he was never a boy to begin with. Wee Georgie Wood, 17. Wee Georgie Wood. Wee Georgie Wood wasn't just a performer. He was a phenomenon, and a contradiction that the entertainment industry never quite knew how to explain. Born in 1895 and standing around 4 feet tall, he spent most of his professional life playing children, well into his 30s, 40s, and beyond. Audiences loved him for it, or at least they believed they did. The joke was always the same. Here's this precocious child with an oddly mature face, cracking jokes like a vaudeville pro and holding court with the kind of smug confidence only a seasoned adult could fake. Except he wasn't faking. Wood was an adult, always had been, and the whole act hinged on that illusion. Not deception exactly, more like complicity. The audience knew something was off, and that was part of the appeal. In the early 20th century, he was a variety show staple, later transitioning into film and radio with mixed success. As tastes changed, the novelty of his act began to curdle. What once seemed whimsical started to feel outdated. And yet, Wood kept performing, riding the very narrow wave of fame that comes from being not quite what people think you are. His dwarfism was never medically detailed in the press, but it was understood, even weaponized, by promoters who framed him as the eternal boy, a living cartoon of youth. That made him a curiosity, a spectacle, and eventually a relic of a performance era that couldn't evolve quickly enough to keep him centered. Wee Georgie Wood is a fitting end to this story, not because he was the beginning, but because he encapsulates the problem. When stature becomes the story, the performer is always in second place. And yet, all 17 names on this list made their mark. Not by fitting into the frame, but by refusing to vanish from it entirely.